So moving on to our main program, I would like to bring up David Brunner, who is the co-founder of AI and Faith. Come on up, David.
If you guys could step up too. You know, I was asked recently, who's Al? Because in certain fonts, our AI and Faith looks like it's Al and Faith, but it's actually artificial intelligence and faith. So today we're going to talk about one aspect of artificial intelligence, facial surveillance. This is the computer revolution we were promised.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory reports. Our unification of the laws is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people. One will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
That's the most famous product launch of all time. It showed once in the 1984 Super Bowl, and it's a legend in advertising circles. So in the past 35 years since that ad ran, computing power unimaginable in 1984 has been widely distributed across the globe. Combined with vast quantities of personal data and new forms of powerful software for sorting that data, this is part of the computer revolution we've received. The goggles these Chinese police are wearing are powered by facial recognition software, tied to a vast trove of personal information about every person in their field of vision. Here is what these police see through those goggles. You can see the little boxes above everybody's in that picture. Those are the identity numbers of each person in the police field of vision, just the beginning of the data that's available to them, just by looking out across the ordinary mass of people on a sidewalk. These photos are part of an extensive surveillance network which powers a social scoring system based on conformity to the Chinese government's model for behavior. Through it, the Chinese government controls access to societal benefits, fundamental ones like work, school, and travel opportunities. It's been rolled out most extensively in Xinjiang province to suppress the cultural and religious expression of the Islamic Uyghur people, who were the historical majority in that province. Today's program asks, what do we residents of Seattle and our fellow Americans want from facial surveillance software as a particular application of artificial intelligence? And how do we get a say in that? Leading off our panel discussion to my immediate right with an overview of the issues surrounding facial surveillance software will be Shankar Narayan. Shankar is a national expert on policy relating to this software tool. Shankar holds a master's degree in public administration from the Kennedy School at Harvard, a Yale Law degree, and practiced technology law at K&L Gates. In 2010, Shankar was named by the King County Bar Association as the Outstanding Young Lawyer of the Year. He went on to serve as legislative director for the ACLU of Washington for 8 years before taking on his present role as director of the ACLU's Technology and Liberty Project. These days, you can hardly turn around on media or in civic discourse without seeing Shankar, most recently at Amazon's shareholder meeting last week, where he was the advocate for 2 shareholder proposals to more responsibly research and manage Amazon's facial recognition software product called Rekognition with a K. Our second panelist, immediately to Shankar's left, has joined us at the last minute due to the illness of Teresa Crecelius, who is from the Muslim Association of Puget Sound, one of the institutional partners of AI and Faith. Masih Fuladi is the executive director of the Council on American Islamic Relations for Washington State, which functions much like the ACLU does, but for the Islamic community in particular. Masih holds a law degree from the University of California at Davis and led the advocacy and outreach programs for CARE of Los Angeles before recently assuming the director role up here in Washington. CARE has been a very active participant in the ACLU-led coalition that Shankar is going to talk about that has been advocating for appropriate facial surveillance. So thank you especially for joining us on short notice today, Masih. Our third panelist and fellow Rotarian, Rabbi Daniel Weiner, needs no personal introduction to all of us, but he's on this panel for reasons that you may not be familiar with. Rabbi Daniel is a long-standing early adopter of technology and has had a long interest in its societal impact. As senior rabbi at Temple de Hirsch, Rabbi Daniel leads a congregation that's full of academic and professional people working in technology. He's been very actively involved in our organization as a founding member of AI and Faith, and Temple de Hirsch is one of our key institutional partners. In recognition of the voices that the faith communities can and should have in answering this question of how do we ethically and appropriately use artificial intelligence in our broader society. AI and Faith includes almost 30 founding members and 7 institutional partners, and I'm pleased to announce today that our 8th institutional partner, Seattle University's new Ethics and Transformative Technologies Institute, has joined us. And Father Steve and Professor Nathan Kalaner from Seattle U, and Nathan, part of that key institute, that newly formed institute, we thank you for your decision to join AI and Faith. So without further introduction, let me turn this over to Shankar to describe to us the issues and related to this important topic.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all of you here out today. I have the thankless and impossible task of attempting to render the impossibly complex topic of face surveillance comprehensible in 15 to 20 minutes. I assure you I will fail, but I will absolutely endeavor to at least lay out some of the basic principles, give you a sense of what has been happening in terms of policy in this space, and then jump into this broader panel discussion that we're going to have. I want to take a step back from face surveillance just to offer some framing and context around the broader technology debate, which I think is important to have here. Right? As you saw in the first ad from Apple, the public narrative we're often presented with around technology is that technology is like a knight riding in on a white horse that is going to fix everything that's broken about our brick and mortar systems, right? Our brick and mortar systems are broken, they're biased, and tech is this neutral thing that is going to supersede those and take us into this impossibly bright future. That narrative really depends on this myth that technology is neutral, but the first proposition that I want all of you to kind of internalize is that technology is never neutral, right? Every technology is a set of value choices. What data to include, what data not to include, even the very question of what we are asking, what problem we are asking the technology to solve, itself is value laden, right? And that then determines the entire trajectory of how the technology impacts in the broader world. So it's very important to remember that these tools are made by human beings. There is no single scientifically valid way to build an AI tool, whether it's a face surveillance tool or whether it's something else. And the people building these tools, of course, are data scientists, right? They are demographically different and often disconnected from the communities that their technologies end up going out to impact. It's important to also recognize, and by the way, this is all super cliff notes. If you want more on any of this, you can look at the live stream of the talk I gave last night at the ACLU's Flights and Rights event, which was live streamed, and that live stream is there. It's about 45 to 50 minutes long, and it's a little bit of a deeper dive than this. Technology has never impacted all communities equally. That's the second thing that I'd like you all to consider, because of course every technology, in addition to containing its own biases, also is released into a context of deep structural inequity in all kinds of ways, right? Whether you look at our criminal justice system, whether you look at our long history of segregated housing, whether you look at the unequal outcomes in our healthcare system, right? That's the world that technologies are going into. And what we are learning, I think, is that unless you explicitly build your technology to not only account for, but to break down those inequities, you almost inevitably end up not only replicating them with your technology, but exacerbating them. And that's the subject of more and more research that we won't have time to cover today. With surveillance technologies in particular, there's a really long history of them being disproportionately targeted towards communities of color. The Japanese-American incarceration is a great example, back-ended by census data and the surveillance technologies of the day that allowed the authorities to find those individuals on short notice and make it very hard to escape incarceration. Every black civil rights leader in the 60s had a dossier, including our very own Larry Gossett. They were subject to infiltration, to bugging, the surveillance technologies of that day. Post 9/11, the Muslim community in New York City was subjected to a years-long program of warrantless surveillance that failed to catch a single terrorist, and that included cameras, that included license plate readers. And despite the fact that it was all struck down as being completely unconstitutional, that only happened after the fact, right? Our constitutional safeguards failed to keep that community safe, as I'm sure Masi can elaborate on. I have a very powerful quote from Stan Shikuma of the Japanese American Citizens League, who has been talking to survivors of the Japanese incarceration. And one really powerful quote that I always remember is one of those survivors saying, well, my face was my crime, right? That was all they did, and that was all it took. What does it mean for one's face to be a crime in a society where face surveillance by the government, widespread, inescapable face surveillance, may become the norm? We have a big question to answer there. And of course, there are structural and process problems in terms of how these technologies get out in the world. One is just transparency. I think these technologies are being released in the world at a far greater clip than people realize, right? We just did a public records request around face surveillance in Washington. Literally dozens of agencies are using it. Maybe one of them has an actual written policy about it, and I don't know that any have actually undergone public scrutiny by an elected official. There is also bias in the technology that I'll get to that further problematizes the narrative around what face surveillance is going to do in our society. So let's get into why face surveillance in particular may be of greater concern, and why we're even having to ask this question of whether face surveillance is compatible with our democracy. I will note that I call it face surveillance and not facial recognition, because almost all of these tools, certainly the tools made by the major vendors, are not just about identification, right? They're also about analyzing someone's face print to determine their affect, right? Whether they're happy or sad, or even things like their propensity to commit a terrorist act. There are products on the market today that purport to do that. So hence the terminology. Face surveillance is both an AI technology and a surveillance technology, right? And actually, it's kind of funny when Seattle Police Department was asked about the jail booking face surveillance system they had, and they said, they were asked about the AI in the system. They said, oh, well, there's no AI there, it just compares photographs, right? And of course, it gives you this idea of the process problem, right? It's almost always the case that very few or no folks within the agency that is accountable to the public actually understand how the technology is making decisions, right? And how accurate it is. The specific list of criteria that I think I talk about when talking about face surveillance being a reason for concern is, number one, it's undetectable, right? It can be used remotely. And it's sort of this remote collection of a biometric. That biometric is immutable, right? You can leave your cell phone at home. You cannot drive your car if you're worried about your license plate being scanned. You can't change your face, or if you did, it would take you a lot of effort. And once your face print is out there, right, in a database, that's it, right? You're identifiable everywhere you go in public, everywhere there's a camera. It can happen before or after the fact. Many of you may be familiar with the Carpenter decision from our Supreme Court, which talked about the government needing to target people and follow them around. Well, guess what? With face surveillance, you don't have to target people. Everyone is effectively a target all the time because there's so much video recording and still images happening in public, right? It can be any video or image before or after the fact, public or private. And of course, again, it's not just ID. The Microsoft, Amazon, and Google products all have affect recognition. A product, for example, called Faceception purports to determine people's dangerousness as well. And there's a study, not too long ago that came out, which has, these two NBA basketball players. If I had my slides, I would show you this a little more convincingly, but they're both smiling, right? One, if you all follow the NBA, one is Gordon Hayward and one is Darren Collison, i.e. one white individual, one African-American individual. Both are smiling, right? Yet this tool rates the white player, Gordon Hayward, as being 57% happy and 0.1% angry, and Darren Collison as being something like 39% angry, happy and 27% angry, right? So many orders of magnitude difference in terms of how those faces are analyzed. And you can imagine, right, a tool like this being incorporated, say, into a police body camera, where this analysis will inform an officer's decision as to whether they are going to draw a gun or use lethal force based on this analysis from this black box tool about how angry or dangerous the individual in front of them may be. This is, by the way, another example of how important it is that we have some way societally to parse the questions that we are asking these tools to answer, right? In fact, if we look at a long history of sort of this physiognomic science, right, people used to try to do this, right? For many, many decades, we've had this conversation about whether people's physiognomic characteristics determine their intelligence, right, or other propensities. And that stuff has long been discredited by science, right? So that the science advanced past that point, and yet we're being dragged back to it because in this case, it's correlation and not causation, right? It's data science that is just purporting to predict what is going to happen based on correlations in the data. That's a very dangerous place to be, in my estimation, and one in which we have really skipped over the conversation we should have had, which is, do we want tools like this answering these questions at all? And particularly dangerous because, of course, people tend to overtrust algorithms even if they are total junk, right? This is a well-documented phenomenon, studied a lot, right? Where, the ACLU, for example, has won cases in which we have had an algorithm opened up to public scrutiny, and the moment it's gone up, right? For example, in a case we had about DNA sample predictive algorithms, and the internet lit up, right? Because coders who looked at the code said, wow, this is basically duct tape code, and yet it's being used to send people to jail because jurors see this, and even when they see experts argue and one say it's totally inaccurate and the other say it's accurate, they still tend to overtrust the algorithm and go along with what it says and convict. So that is sort of an additional human-computer interaction dimension that makes face surveillance particularly problematic. There are other bias studies, many of them sort of piling up now. You may be familiar with Joy Bulamwini's research around face surveillance that showed it to be less accurate, particularly for women of color. ACLU, we did a study against photos of members of Congress where we compared them against jail databases. To be clear, none of the Congress people actually were in those databases, and yet 28 of them were identified as being a match for those photographs by Amazon's recognition product in particular, including a disproportionately high number of members of color. So, the other thing I'll say about face surveillance before kind of getting to current policy is that it layers onto a set of policing practices that in themselves are not equitable currently, right? There are more cameras in black and brown neighborhoods or historically poor neighborhoods. That's been an explicit strategy in some instances, like in New York City. And of course, this ends up over surveilling communities of color now with face surveillance incorporated. It's also applied using skewed databases, right? So when you compare photographs, the thing you're comparing them to is often arrest databases, which are not representative of the rate at which people actually commit crimes. It's more representative of how we conduct policing. And the tool hides these subjective determinations of things like confidence margins and thresholds, best practices that we're finding agencies actually ignore, right? So Georgetown has a great new report out talking about bad police practices where it turns out people are running sketches, right? Literal hand sketches of potential suspects through these face surveillance tools to try to get a match. Or in another instance, someone said, well, the suspect looks something like Woody Harrelson. Someone thought he looked like Woody Harrelson. So they take a picture of Woody Harrelson and run it through the tool to try to figure, and someone gets arrested based on that, despite the probability of an accurate match being extremely low. So that, that's another issue. And of course, we can't see the secret sauce in this instance because these vendors often attempt to use restrictive non-disclosure agreements with police departments and trade secret to prevent the testing of that algorithm. So what's been happening policy-wise in this space? I'll just spend my last couple of minutes on that. As was mentioned in the introduction, we have this incredibly strong tech fairness coalition comprised of leaders from impacted communities, right here in Seattle with a core group of a couple of dozen organizations and then sort of an outer fold of maybe 50 plus that have been really pushing both the private sector and our legislators and regulators to both educate themselves and actually step up to create rules of the road around game-changing technologies like this, right? We need the right structures to surface these technologies, and we need the right substantive policies, including, very importantly, we believe, the right, in some instances, for communities to say no, right? This is not an appropriate technology that's compatible with our democratic system. With the private sector, we've pushed Amazon and Microsoft, including through meetings last year with senior Amazon leadership, senior Microsoft leadership, and leaders from the Tech Fairness Coalition. They've had mixed results. I think Microsoft, through the mouthpiece of Brad Smith, has made some positive statements. But unfortunately, when the rubber hit the road in this legislative session, they opposed a moratorium bill. And what that moratorium bill would have done would have been to halt government use of face surveillance in Washington until two things happened. Until the AG certified that the technology was not biased, and until there was a task force comprised of the voices of disproportionately impacted communities historically by surveillance to talk about how it should and should not be used. So Microsoft basically, I think in this instance said, we don't need to have that conversation. We don't need to stop the technology in order to have that conversation. We disagree, and we disagree particularly stridently because of the bias concerns. Microsoft and Amazon came back with a bill that basically said, the only thing that's off the table is tracking a particular individual over time without suspicion and without a warrant, right? If you want to use face surveillance to track someone over time, you got to get a warrant. What that left on the table, of course, was everything else, right? You want to train your face surveillance on a mosque? Just fine, right? A protest? Just fine. It really didn't take very much off the table as far as we were concerned, and we were surprised, given that community leaders had expressed that the safeguards hadn't kept them safe, that even the safeguards they were proposing were relatively weak. So we hope that that will change in this upcoming legislative session. San Francisco just banned face surveillance, which I think is an amazing thing that shows that actually communities, according to their own values, can come in and say no, right? Rather than jumping straight to the conversation of what the safeguards should be. And we are lucky to live in Seattle, where we have the nation's strongest surveillance ordinance, which requires every piece of surveillance technology used by the city of Seattle to undergo public review, including an assessment of its impact on civil liberties and vulnerable communities. Now, Seattle's system, which never underwent public review, is actually going to come up for public review under that statute sometime in the latter half of this year, most likely, and I would encourage all of you to engage with that process if you are concerned about the impacts a technology like this may have. And then finally, Congress is considering regulation. There are a handful of proposals sort of floating around out there. I don't necessarily expect anything tremendously strong from them, but I do think it can at least help create a floor. Other cities and other states, I believe, have in the works moratoria proposals, somewhat like the Washington one. We will bring ours back next session as well. So in parting, I will say, I think the message is, engage with the process, right? We actually have some of the structures in place here that allow you to do that. Don't let the tech companies write the rules of the road, because ultimately, although there is an important role for technology companies self-policing, the values have to come from us, right? We can't start with the technology and say, here's face surveillance, what do we do with it? I think we start with our values of fairness, accountability, and transparency, and then go back and say, is face surveillance compatible with that? For some uses, maybe not for others. How do we parse that conversation? And also, who gets the opportunity to be in the room when we determine that? So I'll stop there and allow us to get to our wonderful panel.
Thank you, Shankar. If you can take the mic with you, then you can use that mic for our discussion. Let's start with you, Masi. The Council on American Islamic Relations has been a key part of this coalition that the ACLU has been leading around both the legislation and this Seattle process. Could you talk a little bit about why CARE cares about this and your own personal experience around this?
Sure. That's my timer. Use 26 seconds less for the record.
Excellent. We'll grant those back to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Masih Fuladi. I'm the Executive Director of CARE Washington. Before I came up to Seattle, I was the Legal Director and Advocacy Director of CARE Los Angeles for about 5 years. I want to share a little bit of information about myself and then ask you all how relevant you think it is for you to just know about me. I'm a Muslim. I'm Iranian. I'm fasting currently. I own a Quran. I pray 5 times a day. I go to different mosques, about 6 or 7 in the region. Typically, my family enjoys going to different Muslim events together, and we travel from one to the next. I grew up and I went to Islamic school. So all of this information that I shared typically is very private things that you wouldn't necessarily talk to a group of people about in the first conversation you have with them. But unfortunately, the way that the Muslim community has been approached by law enforcement, by the FBI, this kind of information is used to gauge how likely we are to radicalize. So the things that I mentioned are on the list of 20 things that the FBI has indicated that would mean that I'm more likely to be a terrorist. But it essentially says that I can't practice my faith under the First Amendment because all of those things are aspects of my faith that I hold dearly. So when we're talking about facial recognition and we're talking about surveillance, the Muslim community, whether it's in New York with the NYPD, whether it's in Los Angeles with LAPD mapping, even here in Tukwila, there was attempts to map the Muslim community. We have become too familiar with law enforcement, continually trying to surveil our communities, gather information, and then take that information and try to use it in some kind of scientific way to show that members of our community are more likely to radicalize. And unfortunately, those members of the community are always the immigrant populations, those who aren't well-to-do, those who are trying their best to further their lives, but don't have the privilege that some other doctors and engineers might have. So for us at CARE, it's really important to stick up for those individuals because they have the right to practice their religion just like any one of us do. And so that's why we're active in these coalitions, and we want to make sure that the voices of those impacted individuals are brought to the forefront. I remember, and I'll end with this, the most bizarre thing that I was ever asked in an FBI interview, and I did a lot of those in Los Angeles, was the client password for his phone was honey. And they essentially said, "Why is your password for your phone honey?" And he was like, "Because I like honey." And they're like, "Is it because honey is promised to you when you die in heaven?" And I was just blown away. I'm like, really? He can't even pick his password anymore without you scrutinizing it. And I never thought that that would ever come up. So that's the level of just bizarreness and discrimination that the Muslim community has to face. And that community member, I remember they were showing him pictures of his wife. And he said, "These pictures have never been public. How do they have it?" And I told him, "Did you ever go to an airport and have your phone taken away by CBP?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Yeah, they took your phone away, they downloaded all the materials off of it, and now they have all those access to your wife who does wear a hijab, who wasn't wearing a hijab." So that's the level of surveillance that we've seen in our community. So when we think, oh my God, facial recognition is going to be something that's going to be very prevalent, and we see what's happening to the Uyghur community in China, that really terrifies our community.
So Rabbi Danny, you've been, as I mentioned, a founding member of this consortium, AI and Faith, from the beginning, and Temple to Hirsch has been a part of that. Why are these issues of importance to a big congregation like yours?
Well, in addition to first of all, it's wonderful to be here with all my fellow Rotarians. Hello. First and foremost, technology is so integrated itself, so interwoven into our culture and our society that it's unavoidable that we have to comment it on in some way. And one of the things that's most compelling about faith traditions and what faith leaders often try to do is to find ways in which the transcendent elements of our ancient wisdom can speak to something as contemporary and unforeseen as technology. And two key dynamics from many faith traditions and moral philosophies come to mind when it comes to a response to technology in general, facial recognition in particular. One is seeking balance in our lives and in our culture between ongoing competing elements or competing demands, but most specifically something that goes back to the founding generation of our country, and that is the balance between liberty and security. How much are we willing to give up of our liberties in order to attain security? How much are we willing to give into our fears in order to sacrifice our liberties? That's a crucial balance, and that's something that Judaism amongst faith traditions speaks about. And I think particularly beyond theology, the Jewish community throughout history has been both the beneficiaries and the victims of technology and of technological innovation. I think it could be argued that the techno-industrial complex of the Nazis, in terms of commodifying and industrializing genocide, was in some ways the ultimate negative reflection and expression of technology's potential. But the other key thing I think is really important from a religious perspective is the notion of accountability. And I was very taken in doing some research for today and reading some of the current literature that there's an MIT professor, researcher, who's talking about algorithmic accountability as kind of a whole new field of research and inquiry. And what I think is really compelling about this is that if technology is going to be so ubiquitous and so integrated into our culture, then we can't just rely on policymakers and the mandarins of technology companies to determine how it's used and how it's implemented. That truly, we need to, using the, analogizing it to the example of bioethics, that just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should do something. The same thing has to be applied to things like facial recognition, and there has to be deliberate, thoughtful conversations with individuals across the cultural spectrum, not only in technology and public policy, but ethics and philosophy and religion and entertainment and the arts, and they need to all be commenting about on these things in determining a policy and an orientation that is going to have a significant impact upon our culture in profound ways. And the last thing I want to say is indulge a little bit of rabbinic homiletics here. There's a very famous Jewish moral philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, and he talks about how the face of an individual, when you see the face of an individual, that should be a moral compulsion for everybody. That should demand from us empathy, compassion, service beyond ourselves, as it says here. The idea that our faces are now our crimes rather than our moral compulsion is something that we have to take a very serious look at as a society.
Thank you. So we have just a few minutes left, and I'd like to pose one question to all of you, and then I have a question for all of us. So first, we invited Amazon and Microsoft to come, and it looked promising for a while, but then this legislative session happened, and they withdrew. So let me ask you to play devil's advocate for them, and do you see some circumstances in which properly guardrailed facial recognition software could be beneficial to society?
I mean, I think, this is a space in which policy and process both matter, right? I mean, I don't want to sit here as ACLU and okay a given use of a technology that has an impact on someone else, right? That's exactly why we've built the Tech Fairness Coalition. I will say, that there is at least one commentator who has called face surveillance the plutonium of AI, right? And has basically said it should be banned. And I think we largely tend to support that position, right? There may be very, very cordon circumstances in which it would be acceptable, for example, identifying a terrorism suspect. But that does not actually seem to track with some of the incidents, right, that have actually happened in which, there were claims that face surveillance could have been used. So I have yet to really see a convincing example of that being the case. I want to very briefly, in the 20 seconds I didn't use, mention two quick things. One is the one bill I didn't mention from this past legislative session is the Tech Fairness Bill. The first of its kind introduced anywhere in the country, essentially the exact algorithmic accountability concept you're talking about, where before an automated decision system or AI system was used by a public agency, they would actually have to do research about its impact, about the evidence of its efficacy, subject that to public commentary and public approval by the chief privacy officer. No one's yet done that, and I think we are certainly going to bring that bill back. And I think that's appropriate given Washington's status both as a civil rights leader and a technology leader. I'll also mention the second Georgetown report. So one was about bad police practices. The other was about this comparison way back to the beginning of this presentation about the Uyghurs in China, right? Enabled by this face surveillance infrastructure, partly, by the way, powered by Microsoft's face surveillance technology, just called Face API. What that report shows is that similar surveillance infrastructures are being built in Detroit and Chicago as examples, but not just there, layering onto these networks of public cameras. So while we point to the China example as being particularly bad, and it is, we are building similar infrastructures here that are only reliant on, largely without written policies, the good graces of our law enforcement agencies and whoever's overseeing them to not misuse. We should do better than that.
So I'm getting the twirling finger from our Sergeant at Arms. Let me ask all of you a question to think about and give you an invitation. The question is, remember Google Glass from a few years ago that was introduced and withdrawn because it scared everybody and was kind of crazy? What if Google Glass came back with these kinds of capabilities 5 years from now, and you couldn't tell that it was on your spectacles, so you couldn't tell who was using them, and you knew that a lot of people were? would you wear those goggles into this room? Think about it, because you'd never have to worry about who you were talking to. You wouldn't have to. You wouldn't forget names or faces like I do all the time. It could be a real boon, right? Especially if everybody else was doing it. But under what circumstances, and when would you put the glasses on? That's the question I'm going to leave you with. And the invitation is, we have a program after this one, and that's why we're not doing Q&A. Up in the Richmond room on the 4th floor, we have 3 experts on the Uyghur crisis in China and on China's use of social technology to control its society. They're from the University of Washington and Seattle Pacific and the Asian Bureau of Research, 3 of the top experts here. And several of our speakers will be joining us too. Informal discussion for an hour at 1:45 in the Richmond room, up the elevators and to the right on the 4th floor. So I leave you with that, and I thank our panel for your time and your expertise.